Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Welcome to Grace, Liberty, the finished work of Jesus Christ. I'm John Barrett once again, and we're going to continue on our series, The Finished Work, with part 2. Before we get going, I want to give a big shout out to some friends of mine, Alberta and Brian Sweeney out there in Ohio, and their kids, the Sandcastle crew. This one's for you. At the end of the first installment of this series, we had talked about a ransom. We said that the word ransom meant an exchange, and we said that Jesus Christ exchanged his life for ours, and that was what it took to finish the work, the finished work. But today, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about exactly what that ransom was. What was the price that Jesus Christ paid? I'm going to do my best to detail it clearly in a short time, because it could take hours if it was done in exact detail. However, I do want to do it justice. So with that, we're going to start off with Isaiah 53. We're starting in verse 3. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him, and he is despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken and smitten of God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. All right, so I think it's obvious about what we're going to speak about today. We talked about in the first installment, one of the first things we mentioned is John 19:30, when Jesus says, "It is finished." When Jesus said it was finished, he was hanging on the cross, which really puts into context more about what he was saying when he did say that it was finished. And so with that, most times, as we will hear, but most times throughout history, I would say, whenever speaking about the sacrifice of Christ, the main focus is on the physical beatings and torture that he endured. What is most times, and I would dare say almost all times, not spoken about or not spoken about enough, is something that I believe to be just as important, and that was the rejection. You got to understand that this is God Almighty coming down in human flesh. You got to understand that Easter and Good Friday, the cross, the resurrection, started on Christmas, and that God, no pain, no suffering, living forever, eternal, everywhere present, was born into flesh that gets sick, that gets hurt, and yes, gets rejected. And that, I think, is just as important, because from the moment he was born, I would dare say before he was even born, he was rejected. You got to think about the fact that while Joseph and Mary were looking for a place to stay in Bethlehem, they were rejected from staying in the inn. There was no place available. They had to go to a stable. You had the kings and and you had the wise men and the shepherds, and you had all those guys coming to worship. But you also had King Herod, who shortly after Jesus was born sent an army out to kill every child 2 years and younger in that area in order to hunt down and kill Jesus Christ. They then moved to Egypt. As Jesus' ministry came, yeah, he had followers. And yeah, he had some that were devoted. But thousands and thousands of people came to see him. But if you take a look, most of them came not because they wanted to be Jesus, be around Jesus, not because they loved him, because they were looking to get some kind of healing. They were looking to get something out of it. And none of them wanted anything to do with God or Jesus himself. Now, there was an instance when a big group of lepers came to Jesus and asked to be healed. They were healed. No questions asked. And as they walked away, only one of them turned around to even say thank you. Now, I want to remind you that I'm not saying any of these things are requirements. That there are no requirements. Cross and limited any kind of requirements or standards needed. But the point is that it was a lonely existence for Jesus. Even, some of his own people, actually most of his own friends, rejected him. One turned him in. The other one denied that he even knew him. The rest ran away. And even now, the world that he came to die for and live for rejected him. John 1:11. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. We all know, at least at some point in our life, what it's like to be rejected or not liked, or not made to feel important, or accused of doing something we didn't do. But imagine the whole world, or the majority of the world, feeling that way about you. And imagine knowing that you did nothing wrong. You know for a fact that you did nothing wrong. At least with us, there's a possibility that we did something wrong. And you start to question whether or not the accusations are true. Or maybe you aren't good enough. Or maybe there's a reason why nobody likes you. Or a group of people doesn't like you. Or that your friends stopped hanging around with you. And you start to question yourself. I'm not saying that Jesus Christ questioned himself or God. But he was also human, and that's very, very possible. Especially if the majority of the world, especially his own people there in Jerusalem, are rejecting him. So that being said, let's keep that in mind while we are going through as detailed but as brief as possible exactly what did happen. We're going to start off in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Last Supper had just happened. Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. And now it's nighttime. Jesus asks 3 of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, to watch him and to pray for him as he goes off to pray. And they couldn't even do that. They fell asleep. And now Jesus, at this moment, it said, sweat blood. And it's easy to look at something like this and say, it's just a story, it's just the Bible, it can't possibly be true. But this is an actual documented condition called hemochromatosis, in which the stress level on a person is so severe that the heart pumps so hard and that the blood goes through the veins so fast that the blood vessels burst and blood comes out through the pores. That being said, shortly after that, practically an army shows up to get Jesus, led by Judas, one of his own. The high priest, the Sanhedrin, picked up sticks and clubs along the way. And, of course, a whole big group of soldiers who are armed. And they came looking for Jesus. They arrested him. At that moment, there was a brief scuffle, but actually all of his apostles left and fled. Now, you got to remember, Jesus has got a painful condition going on. He's sweating blood. It's not only is it painful, but it's oftentimes causes death. So now he's marched, by the time it's over, 5 times across the city of Jerusalem. He's marched first from the Garden of Gethsemane over to the former high priest's house. And you know that they were beating him. That's what the clubs are for. And they were mocking him and saying things about him. So they arrested him, brought him to the former high priest, who then said, yeah, let's send him to the high priest and have a trial. So they then marched him across the city again and brought him to the high priest, where a mock trial was set up. I'm not saying mock trial because, according to the Jewish law, they weren't allowed to have a trial at night, but this was the middle of the night. They had set up false witnesses, none of which agreed, and most of which didn't have their story straight. And yet, in the end, Jesus Christ was somehow found guilty of blasphemy, the penalty of which is death. So now, suffering from hemochromatosis, being beaten and dragged across the city twice, being mocked and put on trial and lied about, hearing Peter deny him 3 times that he even knew who he was, he is now marched across the city again. And he is brought to Pilate. And of course, the Sanhedrin is bringing him there because they were powerless at this point. You see, Rome controlled all of Palestine, including Israel, Judea, Jerusalem, the whole area. And Rome did not allow the local government to put anybody to death. That was up to them to do, up to Rome. So they had to convince Pilate to put him to death. When Pilate saw what was going on, he didn't want anything to do with the situation. He then sent them off to Herod. Herod was a tetrarch. In other words, he was a king who was set up by the Roman government, Jewish king set up by the Roman government. So he really didn't have power. He just kind of was a figurehead. So they marched him across the city again. You know, he's been up all night. He's bleeding. He's extremely tired, extremely sore. He's being mocked. He's been put on trial and falsely accused and found guilty. And so they get to Herod. Herod just kind of laughs, mocks at him, and sends him on his way back to Pilate. Now, he's sent back to Pontius Pilate. And now, the Sanhedrin, the religious folks at the time, are pushing this situation on Pilate. And they're basically trying to force his hand. So, Pilate meets with Jesus Christ, finds really nothing wrong with him, finds that he has done nothing worthy of death. There is a long conversation, most of which is Pilate talking and saying, hey, listen, just tell me, give me something so I can let you go. And Jesus didn't say a whole lot. When asked if he was king, he says, I am, but my kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate brings him out and says, I don't find anything wrong with this guy. There's nothing wrong with him. But we're going to beat him. Just to appease you. We're going to beat him. And so, this is where it really, really gets devastating. You see, when they took Jesus out to be whipped, it wasn't a whip that maybe you and I may think of. It wasn't an Indiana Jones whip, wrapped up nice and curly. They tied him to a post. stripped him naked, and the whip that they used was called a scorpion. It had multiple thongs on it, multiple pieces of leather, that at the end had iron hooks, and were oftentimes laced with metal balls, glass, and other sharp objects. Now, the men that did this were experts. They did this all the time. They were very familiar at what they were doing, and were very good at it. And so this was meant to be extremely painful, and again, oftentimes brought people to the brink of death, and sometimes even death. You have to remember, he's been up all night. He's bleeding from his pores, sweating blood. He's been put on trial, falsely accused, falsely beaten, mocked, and had all his friends reject him and run away. And so they tie him to the post, and they start beating him with this whip. And remember, there's iron hooks on this. Crucifixion, along with the whipping that normally came with it, was considered one of the most horrible ways for a person to die. This whip with the iron hooks on it tore into the flesh, at first making it red and bruised, and eventually hooking in and grabbing off big chunks of flesh. At some points, ligaments and even bone was exposed. And this is the type of beating that Jesus Christ endured, on top of already going through a nightmare. And when this was done, they then brought him back. Some guards took some thorns and made a crown out of it. Now, the thorns here are not thorns that we may know of, rose bush thorns, something we may see, in our backyards or even in the woods behind the house. But these were big thorns, probably about an inch long. And they twisted it up really tight and jammed it into his skull. And now, on top of all that, you got blood dripping down into his eyes, into the sweaty, open pores. His back is ripped up with chunks of flesh and missing, bone exposed. They then put a robe on him and put a reed in his hand to simulate a scepter, and they mocked him as a king. So again, rejection on top of the physical beating. Now, I'm sure most of us, whether we were younger or older, probably younger, have skinned our knees or our elbows before with our clothes on. Your pants or your shirt is, stuck briefly to the open wound because of the blood and the other things going on. And if you leave it there too long, you also know that it hurts like hell to take it off because your clothes got stuck to it. Well, imagine Jesus' back all torn up with the robe on it. Because then, shortly after, they took that robe off. Of course, reopening all the wounds, if they were even healed in the first place. And so now, if that wasn't enough, he's again rejected. Outright rejected. As Pilate stands him up in front of the crowd of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. They're given a choice. A murderer or Jesus, and one of them can be released. And instead of releasing Jesus Christ, a man who did nothing, who actually came to save, right? We said in the first part in this series that Jesus in John 3:16 through 18, the Son of Man came not to condemn the world, but the world through him might be saved. This man who came not to hurt but to save was rejected. They chose the murderer, Barabbas, instead of Jesus Christ, a man who had done nothing but heal. and expose some religious hypocrisy. So now, the Pilate says, well, what do you want me to do with him? And the crowd begins to chant, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Now, as if it wasn't enough that he was rejected and practically alone most of his life, that he had suffered hemochromatosis, bleeding through the pores. He was marched around the city 5 times, put on a false trial. He was beat and whipped with, having his back exposed. Now they were going to crucify him. So he was made to carry, not an entire cross, just the cross beam. But you're looking at like between 80 to 90 pounds. For those of you who know what a railroad tie is, it was something similar to that. And they didn't have Home Depot back then, so they weren't exactly shaven down, sanded down, nice pieces of lumber. So this is a torn up back, a man who's been physically, mentally devastated, now has to carry this giant piece of wood on his ripped up back through a city of people mocking him and yelling at him, along with 2 other men who were thieves. As you can expect, he didn't quite make it all the way. There was a point where he was physically unable to carry the cross, and so they enlisted the help of another man, Simon of Cyrene, who then carried the cross the rest of the way with Jesus. When they got up there, they placed that cross beam on the vertical beam, and they laid Jesus Christ down. They took nails that were equivalent to 9-inch long railroad spikes, and they put it through his wrist, approximately here. The pictures that you see with nails through his hands aren't accurate because it's well known in the medical community that the palm of the hand is not able to support the weight of a human being. And the Romans knew that too. The other problem with this is that right through that same very spot where those nails were put ran a main nerve, which meant that not only were they shoving a 9-inch nail, through his wrist, which is anatomically considered part of the hand anyway, but there was a main nerve there that this nail went straight through, so the pain was immense. It also would have caused his thumb to collapse like this. So now Jesus Christ his legs are propped up, bent a little bit, and the same spike is put through his feet. They put his feet one on top of the other and put it through his feet. And we've all stepped on rocks before with our bare feet. It's not very pleasant. Imagine a spike 9 inches long being put through your feet. So that being said, what most people don't understand about crucifixion is that it wasn't the pain and it wasn't the bleeding that caused a person to die of crucifixion. It was suffocation. You see, the weight of the body would collapse or fall down upon the chest and the lungs, causing it to be nearly impossible to breathe. So what would happen is then, Jesus would have to push up on his feet, which were nailed to a piece of wood, push up on his feet to eliminate the weight of his body from his chest and his lungs, so he could have a brief second or two of air taken in. And then because his feet were sore, he would be unable to bear the pain, and he would have to let go. Of course, his back is torn up, so he's going up and down this piece of wood. Of course, he couldn't breathe again, so he'd have to push up again. And it went up and down, up and down, catching a brief second of air, and then coming back down. The whole time, pushing up on feet that are nailed, scraping his torn up back on a piece of wood, getting a brief second of air, and then coming back down again. Eventually, what would happen is that the body would be physically unable to push up, and the weight of that body would collapse upon your chest and your lungs. You would be unable to breathe, and you would eventually suffocate. It was a long, long way to die. Some people took a few hours, most took a few days. And this is the price that was paid. This is what happened to Jesus Christ. This is the amazing grace that sets us free. This is the sacrifice. Now, of course, not too long from now is going to be Easter. And on Easter we celebrate the fact that Jesus Christ did not stay on that cross. Not only was he taken off, but 3 days later he arose from the dead and there was victory. But I want you to understand something. If anybody ever says or mentions anything about having to be good, or goodness being a part of salvation, or change proving your salvation, or blessings being anyway connected to obedience, then you need to be reminded about the sacrifice, and that if it was at all possible for us to be good enough, if there was any way that obedience blessed us, then this tremendously horrible, wicked thing that happened to Jesus Christ was for nothing. And if you ever doubt the fact that God loves you just the way you are, then you need to remember the sacrifice. You need to remember that it is finished, because it was also at this time, hanging on this cross, that it was said by Jesus Christ, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is the price that was paid. This was the exchange, the ransom. And so it is finished. And it is grace. And like I said before, Ephesians 2:8, victory comes not by obedience, not by works, not by doing good things, not by changing your life. Victory comes by being persuaded of the grace of God. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound to save the wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I'm see. Amen. I'm out. I'll catch you next time.